All right. Well, thank you for coming to our In Conversation author event. I'm Dave Lucy of Page 158 Books in Wake Forest, North Carolina. We'd love to welcome you all to our store someday, but in the meantime, we are thrilled to have Ellen and Rachel here to discuss their recently published books. Rachel Vorona Cote publishes frequently in such outlets as the New Republic, Longreach, Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, Literary Hub, Catapult, Poetry Foundation, Hazlitt, LARB, the Los Angeles Review of Books. Her book, Too Much, How Victorian Constraints Still Bind Women Today, was published by Grand Central in February. And Ellen O'Connell Whittet is an essayist and lecturer, winner of the Virginia Faulkner Award, which is very cool. Her work has appeared in Vulture, Paris Review, BuzzFeed, Teen Vogue, and Prairie Schooner. And her book, What You Become in Flight, a memoir, was published in April by Melville House, which is one of our favorite small publishers. Both books are available now from Page 158. We'll have links in the description. So we're happy to ship anywhere in the country or the world if you're interested. We appreciate your support. And speaking of support, having a book released in the midst of a nationwide stay-at-home order is going to negatively impact sales of any book, in particular these two. And it pains us as booksellers to not be able to put the books we love in your hands when you visit our store. So we want to ask you to support these authors by purchasing their books wherever you buy books, preferably from your local indie. And if you don't have one, we're happy to be yours. We're at page158books.com. And want to just thank Ellen and Rachel for being here. It promises to be a very interesting conversation. Take it away, Ellen and Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much for having us and for hosting this.
You bet.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Yeah. So I think that to start, I'm going to read a little bit from my prologue of What You Become in Flight. I just realized that Rachel's book I can see it across the room. It's sitting on a table facing me. I should have it here so that I can wave her beautiful cover. But maybe Rachel has one we can show you later so that you recognize it. There it is.
There. Both are side by side.
Yeah. Look at our two beauties. So I'm going to read a very short little part of my prologue from my memoir about being a ballet dancer, being raised, sort of in rehearsal studios and ballet studios. And then the following thing happened and my life changed. There was one lift I spent the whole first half of the piece dreading and the second half giddy from remembering. The lift began with me running toward him, and when he caught me, he'd flip me over one shoulder behind his neck, and I came down over the other shoulder. When the lift went well, we looked at each other afterwards, each of us miracles who had thrown ourselves headfirst into a piece of choreography, caring only that we didn't fall behind the music. That was my fault, he said to the choreographer when it didn't go as well. He took the blame each time. This time I came down clumsily, still half caught in his arms. The choreographer stopped the music, and as her back was turned, Peter said to me, "Make sure your rib cage is facing me so I can get my arm underneath and grab you." He made a swinging motion with his arms, and I understood that I was the invisible shape he was cradling in his gesture. Time and time again, when a lift went wrong, or our timing was not matched, he called the fault his, and then privately told me what I should do differently. We rehearsed together after daily classes when we were sweaty from Grand Allegro and warmed up enough to try the lift full out. It required him to catch me mid-step, lift me upside down and backward all at once. When I was first learning the steps, I would watch videos of other girls who executed it perfectly, the absolute trust they had in their bodies, to mold improbably with the male dancer and create a complementary moving shape. I had never been lifted upside down and backwards all at once before, and I did not know that it took two people to let one fall. In our rehearsal, we did the steps that led me to him. He ran away, he looked back, I ran to him. I would then jump, and he would stop and catch me. That's what was supposed to happen. And like we had rehearsed so many times, I ran toward him and jumped, only to watch him as he continued forward, not stopping, leaving me behind mid-flight. And then I was falling, a low moving kite of music and bones, of hitched breath. I held my breath during that moment when I had no control over our movement. Everything was up to Peter and the ballet and all the training I ever had, and the floor grew and grew until my straight arm hit it, then legs, and my hip that jutted from my black tights like some rare bird. As I rolled onto my back, I felt a fate worse than gravity.
This is just the beauty of doing these live events. Before I start asking you questions, I am going to check the Wi-Fi on my laptop. So,
yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Every once in a while, it goes funky, and I do not want it to that to happen while I am talking to you. So
that's actually an event I did the other day. Someone's Wi-Fi went out.
So, as ideally, we would be like sitting together with coffee, having this conversation. But I'm so glad that we're doing this. That we're doing this period, and I know I remember texting you after I finished reading your prologue because I was just so moved and captivated, and it's just such a wonderful and heartbreaking entry into your memoir. It's just gorgeous.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for reading that. And it's so, in thinking about, there's so many things that I want to talk to you about. But the thing that kept coming back to me, and and this, I think, just says more than anything, says a lot about my own sort of maniacal obsessions. But one of the things that I think is just so compelling is that the story that you tell, of loving, of ballet being your first great love, and then the experience of having to put it behind you, and then finding yourself as a writer. It's one of narratorial agency. You describe how, as a ballet dancer, you would step in and out of other characters' story arcs, and which is, and the way that you sort of draw that out is so textured. And when we write, obviously we're also telling stories in sort of in the sort of conventional way that we think about that. And in the case of memoir, we're telling a story about ourselves. And I'm not a memoirist like you, but in my own experience of writing personal narrative, I know that it tends to demand that I confront myself as a sort of character, who I am, who I want to be, the roles I play in day-to-day life. And I was really wondering to what extent this has been true for you. To what extent did this transition from ballet to writing lead or sort of necessitate a sort of personal reckoning?
Yeah, I think that ballet taught me so much about the different costumes that we can wear and the different roles we play, because that's literally, what I spent my life doing up until the point when I started writing. Yeah. And so I think that I never sort of divested myself of that belief that I could wear different costumes in order to be different people, which is useful in memoir because, depending on your purpose and your audience and, all of these sort of rhetorical considerations that you have while writing, your self changes and your presentation of self changes. So I would say that if I didn't write memoir, I think that I would be harder on my young self. I don't know what it is, but I think women especially can be really merciless. Mm-hmm. with how we think about and remember, our 20-year-old selves. I don't know why we think we should have known any different or any better. But actually looking back at that self and trying to craft a self that was at once both flawed, but also relatable to people who did or didn't dance. I didn't want to alienate people who weren't ballet dancers, because I think that there's something in these kinds of crises that, is quite universal. But I wanted to render myself in a way that other people would relate to. So then I had to relate to myself and forgive myself and think of myself as more likable than I think I naturally did. Like, how do you follow somebody that is so stupid? You can't. So I had to sort of like think, well, maybe that's not how I was. Maybe I was just a really young person who was in the grips of questioning and myself, and also, sort of the patriarchal structures of ballet. And that helped, I think, to reconcile my young ballet loving self with my older critical writer self. And I think actually, in the end, that felt good. That felt like what I should have done anyway, but it was writing that facilitated that process.
And I think one of the things that's just so marvelous about your book is that you do this world of ballet. You do make it so. You so sort of conceptually and personally resonant. There were things I think I mentioned to you when I had no illustrious career, nothing like that. But when I was young, I danced for about 10 or 11 years. And the thing is, there were little pieces here and there that, that struck a chord, but mostly it was resonant because of the way that you were writing about performance and identity and femininity. And I think, that's such a gift to take something so particular and find all of the ways that, all of the different threads that and little rivers that connect outward. And so I want to pull on on one of those threads that we've already sort of talked about, and go a little further into into performance, which you write so fluidly about, and the act of performance, and in its various manifestations. And one of the things that you do is emphasize the nuances of performing of it as a ballet dancer, but also at the same time sort of laying bare the things that you can't hide. And this sort of dynamic, exists beyond the dance studio too, as people living in the world. And especially so many of us, especially those of us who have been fortunate to have some graduate study, to read Judith Butler, we sort of talk about how we're always performing, whether we're talking about gender or class, or even just an emotional state. So I'd love for you to talk just a little bit more about how ballet has shaped the way that you think about yourself as a performer of everyday life, and maybe the way that it's shaped how you think about authenticity. I think sometimes I find myself in this place where I'm like, God, is there anything that we do that's ever really authentic? And I know that that's sort of like a weird and bulky question, but especially I think women who write, we're supposed, there's this burden of authenticity, right? Like we're supposed to be vulnerable and you know, present this sort of genuineness, but it's kind of, it's, you know, it's never that straightforward.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting thing to think about when we are authentic, if we can really be authentic. I think even, I mean, in writing, just the awareness, sort of like dancing, that there's an audience right there makes it very hard to be, you know, to separate yourself from the knowledge that you're being, you know, judged and, you know, hopefully consumed sort of critically. But even I think when I was a kid and I would try to keep a journal or a diary, I think I was very aware that like someday I could be famous and someone could find this journal. And so, you know, I think even then the writing wasn't particularly like free flowing from some sort of pure place of just self-expression. I guess, you know, when I think about audience and authenticity, I think for me, it's like what audience I want to impress. Like, who do I want to be sort of authentic for, and what do they consider authentic? So like, you know, when I write even just like smaller articles, I think about writing for women because that's who I am and that's who I understand. And I think that, you know, vulnerability is different from authenticity, of course. But what might feel authentic in an expression of an experience or, you know, an emotion or something to an audience that I care about, and then the rest I kind of discard because it's like you can't be vulnerable for every audience. You can't be authentic really on the page. I think we have pockets of like authenticity in our lives, but once we start thinking about them and narrating them or dancing them or whatever, you know, I don't know that I believe that we can be authentic, which is, it sounds so cynical and I don't mean it to, but I just think humans are sort of, and especially women, are so constantly aware of the gaze on ourselves that we turn it on ourselves, which is so much, you know, what ballet taught me. I was constantly looking in a mirror as I danced. So maybe on stage, there, you know, with all the other eyes besides mine, I was actually able to be more authentic because I wasn't the one looking. But, you know, when you have hundreds of eyes looking at you, I don't know how you can, how you can do it. So, yeah, I mean, I wish I had a neater answer for that question because it is such a good one. But I think it's really hard for women because I think we're self-editing constantly, you know, from childhood, we're self-editing.
Yeah. And, you know, like, no, and I don't think, I mean, God, I don't think that there is a neat answer that anyone could possibly give. I mean, I think, you know, ultimately it kind of almost sort of feels like a red herring. Like we tell the best stories in the best possible way that we can. Try to, you know, we try to be as honest as we can, sitting in the place that we are, you know, whatever honesty means in that moment. But yeah, you know, I think it's
a good goal, I think, to try to be authentic. But I also think that it's important to, you know, sort of keep thinking critically about what that could even mean, because it's hard to write authentically if you can't even recognize that you're living authentically, or, you know, what that might mean.
Oh yeah. And I mean, and I think that you're absolutely right. You know, that it is like there is this burden. I know that, you know, this is a conversation that I think has been that we've been having in so many ways, you know, as we like relitigate the personal essay for the 50 millionth time. And like, you know, there's these really wild expectations, specifically for women identifying people in the way that we write and what we say and how we say it and what we're willing to give of ourselves. And, you know, especially for those of us who do disclose more, it's something I think that we become really hyper aware of, you know, what we're giving and how we're giving it.
Exactly.
And, so to move, not to be, it feels a little weird to be like, so let's not talk about your body.
I wrote a whole book about it, so
yeah. That's the thing, your memoir. I mean, it's it's so many things. It's a Künstlerroman. It's also a story of bodies, your body specifically, and even more specifically, your body in pain. And I, as I read, I felt just a real urgency in your prose to articulate what so often for women, as you say in your memoir, what is so often silent, whether it's a dance injury or childbirth or menstrual pain or mental illness. So could you just talk a little bit about the experience of writing your body? I mean, what did it mean for you to write a book as physical as this?
It meant thinking about sort of every part of my body and how it feels now and how I wrote that feeling into existence from childhood. So, even now, if I'm sitting and I sort of need to stretch or, I'm feeling tense or sore or something, I think about the origin of that. Like, when did that start? And I don't think I would think about that if I weren't writing it, but when did that start? When did I start feeling back pain? When did I start feeling like my ankle click in the morning? What is the origin story of each small pain, and how is it connected to, the story that my body wrote before I was sort of even conscious that it was doing that? I say in the book that I was a diarist all through my youth, but my body was the text that I was writing. And it's so, the older I get, the more true that feels. Like, all the things that started as small, contained aches and pains or sensations, not even necessarily pain, just sort of magnify, I think, as we age. And like you were talking about menstrual pain, which I don't even necessarily talk about in the book, but that's something that I think is really common for people with uteruses and, people who menstruate. When did that start becoming something that I was silent about, or that I felt embarrassed about, or that I ignored, or that I treated? How did I treat it? How is that different from how I would, tell somebody else, like a younger person now, to treat it? So, I think that each sensation in our bodies tells a story. It tells our story, and it tells a story of how we are either connected to or sort of divorced from our bodies, how we see this sort of false binary where our bodies are separate from our true essence, of our minds or spirits or souls or whatever. And in fact, the body's integral to all of that because it reveals something about our minds and spirits and souls. And also, it was interesting to notice how my back pain still affects me today. So I had this catastrophic injury in the rehearsal. I was dropped, and I had always had some back pain that I had ignored. And then this was sort of, I joke, the straw that broke the camel's back. But, there are things that I do today to compensate for this injury that I sustained when I was about 19. And writing really hurts because you sit for a long period of time, and you stand up after writing for 2 hours and you realize you're not supposed to sit for that long slumped over, over your laptop or something. Yeah, exactly. So writing, I think, became really physical because I was so actively engaged in this process of, questioning my own body.
Yeah. And, and that's one of the things that I think is so, interesting, is that, your memoir is, sort of divided into two parts. The loosely when you were dancing, and then when you were sort of coming into your own as a writer. And, it would, I think humans, we tend to grasp at binaries, and it would sort of be easy, if wrong, to say, oh, well, there's dancing, and then there was writing. So, we've got the physical, and then we've got the mental. But that's something that you really resist in the book. And one of the ways that I think that you do that is skillful is by bringing Helen Keller and Martha Graham's their sort of shared experience into the mix. And I love Helen Keller's remark when she learns what jumping is, and says, oh, how like the mind it is, which I think is just such a vivid way of emphasizing what you're talking about here, that there is, a reminder that there's, all of this is porous. And so, and I feel like you've already sort of talked a little bit about this, but I wonder, if there are any lessons that writing has taught you about your body, or lessons that writing has taught you even about dance, maybe, of course, together with the fact that, like sitting for hours, like we become so aware of that. But I wonder if just the sort of the retrospection, if there were, again, in that process of writing the body, what if, or maybe that's like I'm realizing kind of a deeply personal question.
I mean, it's such an interesting question. I haven't thought so much about this, but I think, because I think we have a recognition that writing, or that writing is an embodied act, that there is no sort of default body. I mean, we have thought that for, like hundreds of years, that sort of a white male, cisgender, heterosexual, whatever, that is the default. And writing changes because your experience changes dramatically when you deviate from that. And the more, of course, you deviate, the more your experience differs from that imagined norm. So I think that by sort of like, I don't know, going to college and going to grad school and hearing those sorts of ideas articulated, which is, not revolutionary. It's like fairly obvious stuff, but
it feels revolutionary when you read it. I mean,
exactly.
Ever have thought, it's just me right now.
Exactly. There is no objectivity. I mean, yeah, it's like, oh, of course, that's why so much of that writing, that you read in college that is supposed to be objective, especially if you study journalism or something, you just realize like that's an impossible order, and it is not a useful order. But I think that allowed me to apply that to dance as well. And in dance, I mean, dance is a very Western European art form. It often costs money to go see dance. I mean, almost always, except for right now, actually, one of the sort of strange, wonderful things happening in the dance world is that a lot of it is just broadcast for free. Like New York City Ballet is just broadcasting their performances, which is, like such a gift. And I don't know why it didn't happen so much sooner to make it accessible. But, also like the bodies you see on stage, with a few very notable exceptions, are the same race, the same size, so all of those things. And thinking about how there is actually a default body in ballet, at least for a female ballet dancer, made me think about the ways just like the angle of my knee or something deviated from that, and how that was, that was something that there was not room for in the ballet world. And I could like tell you every single thing that's wrong with my body, because I've been told everything that's wrong with my body, from starting with, like the shape of my toes all the way through the length of my neck or whatever. But I don't know. I think just seeing in writing how that plays out and how that's actually a strength, you have something different to say, you have some subjectivity, and how I still think in dance is, well, in classical ballet anyway, that's not yet a strength. It's a flaw, which I don't think is the way we should think of it, because I think that it alienates so many body types of different sizes and shapes and abilities. But I think it allowed me to sort of realize the fault was not mine for not being good enough. The fault was ballet's for not making more room for more different kinds of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I'm just curious, what are some things that you would like to see change in the ballet world? I mean, one of the things I'm thinking of particularly, is, and that I thought was so, I felt like my brain sparked when you introduced it in the book, is the issue of consent, because again, something that you talk about, but walking into a dance class, there are certain things that you're expected, or at least as I recall, you're expected to accept, that your body is going to be touched and moved. I still have this very visceral memory of an instructor who's wonderful and who absolutely was not trying to hurt me, but who had very long nails. And I guess I hadn't clenched my stomach sufficiently, and she just poked it, and just in a place where I'm very sensitive, and I could feel it. Because I just remember thinking, oh shoot. But thinking also, you just got to be quiet and keep going, because that is because the fault was mine. My posture wasn't exactly what it needed to be. And so, between that and the sort of the, what you're saying about the exclusivity when it comes to bodies and ability, if somebody were to say to you, here, create a new Bill of Rights for ballet or something, like what would sort of be your top items?
Well, that story that you just told makes me think, I mean, the way I would have experienced that, and I don't know how you experienced it, but my guess is maybe similarly, is if someone pokes you in the stomach, your response is to suck in. Your response is like, oh no, I was sort of, to take the title of your book, I was too much, my stomach was too much, too big, whatever. And in fact, that's not actually what you should be thinking about. What you should be thinking about is the chain of muscles in your abdomen supporting your legs as you're moving, so that you are, able to brace your own body against injury and be stronger in your dancing. So I would think that explaining that rather than just poking a young girl in the stomach would be more helpful. And, you don't always have time to do that. But I think that I never feel entitled to touch other people's bodies. I sort of can't imagine that anyone would. And yet, if I were a teacher passing somebody at a bar, I think there are so many better ways to very quickly say, think about, wrapping your stomach inward so that your rib cage is not poking out. You're not, playing out. And that's about muscles and bones rather than fat, which is maybe not even what that teacher intended, but, I think at least how I would experience it, and probably how a lot of young dancers would experience it. So not touching unless you really need to for safety's sake. And then I think even for safety's sake, saying almost like you would to a baby, I am going to support you here because I don't want you to, bend too far back or something like that, so that you explain the reason. But it shouldn't be the default to just touch someone.
Yeah.
Another thing with my Bill of Rights is that I would want more women choreographers or women identifying choreographers. Choreographers are historically almost always men, and those are the famous ones whose names we know, like George Balanchine or Maria Petipa. So having some women in there would change the whole aesthetic. I think point shoes are hugely damaging. Men don't have to wear them. They really are hard to move in. They create skeletal problems that last women a lifetime. If you don't have the right feet or training or musculature, then they can be, hugely damaging. And I think that they actually probably were for me. So I would probably stop hobbling women and allow them the full agency of their movement. But yeah, consent between partners, between teacher and student, between choreographer and dancer, all of those things, I think would have to shift. And I think they would shift if we had more women in the studios, who were in charge of the movement. I think that women don't necessarily assume that they're entitled to touch other people's bodies all the time. Not that all men do it all, but like in my experience, a lot of male teachers have done things that I just think, how did he think that he was allowed to do that? And how did I think that he was allowed to do that and not say something?
Yeah.
So yeah, those would be about three things. Yeah. But I realize that we should switch to your book. We're at about a halfway point, and I would love to hear more about women in a different arena. I'd love to hear about Victorian women.
I could talk about this all day. So we do not have to, but
no, I really want to. I love your book, and I'm so excited for other people to discover it and read it. It's as somebody who also loves Victorian literature. I didn't study it formally the way you did, but my dad was an English professor. My mom was a English major and had a master's in it, but she also raised me on all the mini series. And so it's like, I would read the book and then watch like the 12-part, period drama adaptation of it. So I just think it's so much fun to think about how these things are still not only relevant, but in some ways our origin stories and, as you say in your subtitle, binding, constraining us to this day, taking what we love and leaving what we don't. And that's so much the sort of the argument that I think you're making by the end of this book. So would you read something and let me ask you a couple questions?
Sure. So this is such a cultural thing too, like the dance of like, oh, should we? Is it okay? Like,
yeah, exactly. I know.
Sure. Well, I'll just read the first 4 pages of the intro, because that's sort of a serviceable entryway into the topic, and it
introduces everything.
Yeah. So the first chapter is called Wonderland and Introduction. A weeping woman is a monster. So too is a fat woman, a horny woman, a woman shrieking with laughter. Women who are one or more of these things have heard, or perhaps simply intuited, that we are repugnantly excessive, that we have taken illicit liberties to feel or fuck or eat with abandon. After bellowing like a barn animal in orgasm, hoovering a plate of mashed potatoes, or spraying out spit in the heat of expostulation, we flinched in self-scorn. Ugh, that was so gross. I am so gross. On rare occasions, we might revel in our excess, belting out anthems with our friends over karaoke perhaps, but in the company of less sympathetic souls, our uncertainty always returns. A woman who meets the world with intensity is a woman who endures lashes of shame and disapproval from within as well as without. In Victorian England, the medical establishment would have labeled us hysterical, pathologically immoderate in emotional and physiological expression. Here's how a German-born doctor practicing in London, one Julius Althus, defined the condition in 1866. All the symptoms of hysteria have their prototype in those vital actions by which grief, terror, disappointment, and other painful emotions and affections are manifested under ordinary circumstances, and which become signs of hysteria as soon as they attain a certain degree of intensity. Of course, a certain degree of intensity invites a vast range of interpretation. And when it came to emotional eruptions, the Victorians were none too generous. Hysteria was a convenient means of pathologizing and thus regulating feminine feeling and its expression. Today, as many among us grieve our political optimism and hammer out our anger on social media, we find our husbands, our boyfriends, our parents, our politicians diagnosing us with similar maladies. We're wallowing in it. Why are we so freaked out? We must be bleeding out of our wherever. Take a Xanax, girl, and calm down. We are the women who can hardly contain our screams, and oftentimes we don't. Our muchness oozes from our pores like acidic sweat, ranker, more caustic, less concealable than ever. But however brutally the stigma may sizzle in this political moment, this sense that we are somehow too much is hardly new to us, nor will it dissipate whenever Donald Trump's vise finally unclenches from our skulls. I conceived the idea for this book, a critical cry of bullshit against this concept, too much, some years ago during a comparatively happier presidency. This term, too much, pernicious in its ambiguity, attacks with the force of history. It's the overdetermined exponent of ideologies, centuries old, structured by misogyny, racism, and homophobia. American society fetishizes white heteronormative propriety. It wants its girls pliable and demure, girls who safeguard both tears and sex for the privacy of the bedroom, who keep their voices measured during meetings, and who brush their hair and blot their lipstick. It worships the woman who, if she should experience distress, will wear her sadness like Lana Del Rey or Middlemarch's Dorothea Brooke, with genteel sensuality and relative quiet. Anything more, well, that would be excessive. Accordingly, "You're just too much" is the threat of patriarchy disguised as playful admonition. It is a warning, even a diagnosis. It is saying, this space is not yours to colonize. This power is not yours to claim. Systemic oppression relies on the careful partitioning of social space. Specifically, it requires that marginalized peoples, of which women are one broad example, and women of color and queer persons are more pointedly targeted ones, dwell within corners, that we shrink inside walls that loom and compress. The public devises unspoken rules of deportment born from anxieties over what we can bear to see expressed, and accordingly, whom we are willing to allow the privilege of expression. Reluctant to countenance emotional and physical extremes in any case, women, long regarded as the lodestars of excess, are eyed like shapeshifters with the power to transform into Medusa. But I've since realized that there is power in what others call monstrosity. Our refusal to abide, to prioritize the comfort of the West's hegemonic governance, lays bare the rickety scaffolding of culture's so-called behavioral norms. The roots of rules are never so deep that they cannot be wrenched from the soil. Man-made boundaries remain at the mercy of the creatures who erected them. For when we are too much, and when we refuse to apologize for that, we burst against those walls and marvel as they give way like sand.
Well, that's so wonderful. Thank you. What I love about that introduction is that it sets up not only obviously the argument that you spend the entire book proving, but also by holding like Dorothea Brooke and Lana Del Rey in the same sentence, it shows so much of what sort of the tenor of your book will be, your own experience alongside the pop culture that you love, or at least interrogate alongside the Victorian literature that you studied. And one of the things that I think is so wonderful about all these blending and sort of weaving of all these different strands that you're doing throughout each different chapter is you choose one different too muchness, as you call them, or something that's too much, like too loud or too fat, or these accusations that are lobbed against women who, as you say, are out of line according to the patriarchy. And you hold each one up to all these different lights and sort of turn it, looking at this particular argument through all these different lenses that I mentioned, to talk about how that too muchness has been historically weaponized and is still weaponized in modern times. So I'm wondering, as somebody with, who's you're ABD in Victorian lit, right? Okay. So as somebody who has that kind of, sorry?
Oh, just in perpetuity.
In perpetuity, yeah. This is your constant state. As somebody who has that formal academic training and background, has pivoted to become a more sort of mainstream writer with a larger audience. I think of you now as like a cultural critic. I think of you as I don't think of you as a memoirist, although there is quite a bit of your personal experience woven into this book. But I'm wondering what your sort of access point is, like what comes first and what are the other things that you weave in to sort of support that. I would imagine it's the Victorian literature, but I actually have no idea. And I thought I would ask you what came first and then what supports that.
No, I think you're correct. I mean, I think that I guess if I were to be a little bit more specific, I think that the access point was the recognition of my emotional investment in Victorian literature. What it specifically was, what wasn't just intellectually fascinating for me, but also was clearly the stuff that I took personally. Mm-hmm. And that actually came from, and I talk about this a little bit in the intro, seeing the Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland and being really interested in the way that the characters in this particular story kind of freak out over Alice when she returns when she's 19. When she returns to Wonderland, they're all like, "Oh my God, you've lost your muchness. Alice has lost her muchness. Whatever we do," and in the very particular sort of Lewis Carroll plus Tim Burton way. Yeah. And I thought that was it really, I just, this word really stuck with me because it occurred to me that if, it's a made up word, and in the world that in the world of the film, it's positive, it's chutzpah, her verve, it's they're worried because they feel like as time has passed and she's become an adult, she's sort of lost herself. And I realized that if you had just given that word to me and asked me to come up with a definition, mine would have been very negative. It would have, to sort of draw on what we were talking about earlier, that sort of impulse to be self-castigating, to think about the worst of ourselves, or what we perceive to be as the worst of ourselves. I would have taken it very personally and thought about it in terms of excess, of being fundamentally excessive, particularly in an emotional way. That it seemed to me to be that it would have suggested a state of being fundamentally too much, as it were. And I think it was just really, even though, if I'm honest, I could take or leave the movie itself. I think that it was a real gift for me that it happened that I found this word in an adaptation of a Victorian text, you know, in Alice in Wonderland, because it, you know, really it did some work for me. It got me thinking about this very ambiguous, this you know, what I would say perniciously vague term of, you know, being too much, and this idea of muchness or too muchness, as I call it in the book, and it sort of directed my attention to the texts that I was already so wrapped up in, and was, you know, I was already, like, I can't remember. I think I had already written a paper about Alice in Wonderland at that point. That was that actually turned into part of the book, in which, you know, I talk about how the narrator of Alice in Wonderland is just, you know, condemns Alice to all of these fluctuations. Like she you know, she's being punished for being this you know, intense little girl, and so, you know, I think that was sort of where it began. And then, you know, because I you know, I kind of the way I think there tend to always be all of these, you know, these little vectors, and I'm kind of a voracious consumer of pop culture, and so I think that came into it pretty in terms of the way I was thinking about it, pretty fluidly, because you know, I think, you know, after you get into a mode of thinking, and then you sort of carry it with you to whatever your whatever text you're thinking about, whether it's a song or a film or you know, a big doorstop of a 19th century novel.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And I love learning in that opening that this sort of reframing of too muchness as a wildness, that people were disappointed that Alice was, you know, lost because she was like grew up and, you know, conformed and domesticated or whatever, allowed you to sort of re-examine how, you know, you thought of your own excesses, your own too muchness. And in fact, I think it did that for me too. Your book sort of made me think about all of the ways I'm bulging at the seams as like, well, that's just me being full of who I am. You know, that's not something that I necessarily need to change. And I'm wondering, as somebody who writes memoir in this book, but also as you know, just a woman writer on the internet, I see this claim of being too much sort of lobbed against writers as a silencing mechanism. People who write about personal experience, people who write about pop culture in a way that doesn't demean or diminish the women they're writing about. How did you decide how much of yourself was enough to put in this book? I mean, there both is and isn't that much of you. You know, we get these beautiful, very vulnerable little glimmers of who Rachel is in relation to what she's thinking about, but also, you know, then you disappear and you let the things that you're thinking about sort of take the spotlight. And then also, how did you decide how much of all the different genres that you're juggling was just enough rather than too much?
Oh, it was, you know, it was really, you know, this is my first book. And it was difficult. It was a tricky experiment because, you know, I'm was coming, as you know, as you said, you know, I was coming out of an academic context, and I was trying to figure out how I wanted to proceed. That, you know, I wanted to hold on to my academic enthusiasms, but I wanted to write about it in a way that that felt correct and facilitating for the argument that I wanted to make, which I knew was such a personal argument that it would really be disingenuous to pretend that I wasn't, that I wasn't, or to take myself out of it. I knew that wouldn't be possible, and so I thought that, well, better to purposefully incorporate a little bit of personal anecdote where it seems to serve the point that I want to make, or the argument that I'm drawing out, where maybe it would lend some more texture, than to spend the entire process of writing the book constantly trying to hold myself back, which I felt like probably would end up showing, because I didn't think that would be something I'd be able to do. And so ultimately, I wanted to be really rigorous about where I entered the text in the form of a little bit of memoir. So for me, the question was, will sharing this particular anecdote or this memory or this experience, will it help me get at something that I wouldn't necessarily be able to get at if I didn't share it? So even, it was really, writing the chapters about self-harm, and the chapter about the disillusion of my first marriage, first very brief, like flash in the pan marriage. Those were really, I can't really necessarily call the writing of it pleasant, even though I think it was fulfilling and necessary. But I knew that there was no way to fully flesh out what I wanted to say about the way that we think about historically, the way we think about women identified persons in relation to mental illness, and there was no way for me to think about this, the question of fallenness, sexual fallenness, without, or perhaps I could have done it. Yes, I could have done it, but I felt as if I would be able to get to something a little fuller, and hopefully maybe more inviting, and less, and what's the word I'm looking for? Less sanitized, like overly sanitized, that allowing myself in the text would soften and make things a little bit more capacious, and I think hopefully more, less removed. And it was important to me. I did so much of this book, felt to me about a project of insisting upon empathy and radical empathy. And I felt like I couldn't fully articulate that if I didn't indicate the extent to which I have skin in the game, the extent to which I'm, that this is personal for me. So, to the extent that I could be a useful case study, that was sort of where I would decide, okay, well, I'll tell this particular anecdote. And then, when it came to more contemporary cultural texts and touchstones. You know, I wanted there to be a sort of robust historical grounding, but I wanted there to be enough of enough contemporary discussion to you know, to emphasize the different ways, you know, the ways that this particular historical inquiry can shape the way that we read, you know, so much. And it was also especially important because, you know, Victorian literature, or at least the Victorian literature that has been canonized and that we study, it's, again, you know, like ballet, white, and, well, in this case, more masculine, but heteronormative, cisgender. And it was really important to me that my book not just perpetuate the same sort of ideology and the same sort of privileging that that has been so tenacious, and overwhelming, and I knew that was gonna, you know, that was something that the burden was on me to be really careful about, because I knew that I was beginning with a lot of texts by a lot of white cisgender people.
Yeah,
and that was not what I wanted. That's not where I wanted to end up. That's not where. I didn't want that to be the end point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that you handled, you know, all of that so beautifully by, like, acknowledging, yes, these are the people who wrote it and probably read it back then, and yet these are the ways that everybody can access it today. These are, you know, like, everybody has some personal stake in the values that this writer was putting forward in, you know, whatever particular text you were dealing with in that chapter. One thing that I've been thinking about during our shelter in place order, that I keep seeing crop up that you talk about in the book, is this particular meme of Britney Spears, sort of mid head shave with the caption, like, if Britney could survive 2007, we can survive this, or you can survive today, or, you know, some variation of that sentiment, as though, like, she should not have survived, like, against all odds and against all logic. She survived, you know, having a very public breakdown. And in fact, we don't really know what happened. Yeah. But I've seen that come up, you know, sort of around the coronavirus and just how difficult life is for so many people right now. And you articulate so well in the book all the reasons that meme always makes me uncomfortable, or why I've never thought it was particularly funny, by pointing out that the lens of Britney Spears's mental health is not perhaps the only lens to look at her through. There's the lens of her being an early aughts pop culture icon and having an incredible career and contributing so much to pop culture beyond just having had mental illness, public breakdown. So one thing that I've heard over and over again is that Britney Spears actually is sort of emerging as an icon of this coronavirus time, in her own social media, and she's starting to author her own story a little bit more. We have not heard from her. She's been sort of, I think, kept by her management back from the public.
Father, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is incredibly creepy. But she's posting about yoga, and she was, I think it was short-lived, but she was trying to do like a yoga pose a day to, you know, help people, which was so delightful. I mean, just like, what a thing for Britney Spears to do. And then there was something about her running, you know, faster than Usain Bolt. And then people were laughing at her. And then she was like, I was the one making the joke. But then also she's posted all this, like, she posted this one meme in particular about wealth redistribution, or I don't know, it wasn't a meme. It was just a quote about wealth distribution. So she's being very interesting and showing us all the lenses we have been missing all along when we talk about her. I'm wondering, you know, when we think about these these people who are either the butt of jokes in Victorian literature, the butt of our jokes today that, you know, become sort of viral memes. What is the line between being a joke and being inspiring? You know, I think that if Britney could survive 2007, she could survive today. It's supposed to inspire us, or you can survive today. It's supposed to inspire us, but instead it's sort of derisive and dismissive. And so what do you think is the sort of the difference between a joke versus inspiration?
And I think it kind of, it changes, I think, with the cultural conversation, I think, and just our cultural attention span, I think, is just so short-lived. It just, and I think that public figures like Britney, or, you know, Comrade Britney, as I'm starting, welcome.
Welcome to the edition. I will follow you.
I think that, well, I think a lot of it, you know, and I think, you know, there's of course the caveat. We don't know who is maybe involved in her Instagram curation. And this is not something I can speak to, like someone like Helen Peterson could, you know, and sort of thinking about celebrity culture and everything that we just do not see in terms of the way that they sort of curate, you know, their self-presentation is curated. But, you know, so much of it comes down to publicity, but I also think that the line between the boundary between punchline and inspiration, it's so dependent on who's circulating the images, who's controlling the narrative about this person, whether they have any control, and how it's going to be received. And, you know, it's hard because, you know, I find so much about Britney Spears delightful, but I always, I'm like the ideal consumer. I am such a sucker. I want to believe that everybody is lovely and would love me the way that I just want to love them, you know, and that's really great for capitalism, because I am so, you know, emotional, you know, being really emotionally porous and wanting to believe that that celebrities or politicians that maybe that they do have our best interests in mind, you know, that's a really dangerous thing. And so I'll kind of like overcorrect when it comes to people that I'm inclined to sort of to gush over, like, you know, like Britney Spears, because I find her adorable in so many ways. But, you know, but I do also think, you know, like the image that you're talking about, you know, it's, you know, those sorts of, I think we always have to question and think about who's controlling the circulation of images of femininity, or images of women, women identified persons, and how are they circulating them, and what sort of narrative are they trying to build with it. And so that Britney meme, you know, I think, you know, there's a difference, and I think this is something that I talked about in a written interview with another woman who asked about her. You know, like, I think that there's with that meme, there's a difference in, you know, two women who both have a sort of affection for Britney Spears sharing it and posting it on the internet as something that's supposed to have a little shock value, because of course, part of the idea is shock, right? We're there's Britney Spears without her trademark long blonde hair, looking sort of wild-eyed and feral, and so yeah, we're supposed to be responding to the dissonance between what she looks like there and what we're used to her looking like, and so her body is sort of, again, it comes back to a body being made to tell a certain type of story, and so I think that's so much of what is happening there with that meme. What she's this particular image of her, what there was a very particular intent that where, yeah, it did sort of feel like she was being sacrificed to some extent for the point of the meme. And like most of the time when it comes to celebrities, I would say, well, they can probably take it. They're wealthy, they're well protected. And I think the thing that makes Britney Spears different is that eventually it came to light that she, might be a very rare example of somebody who's actually not protected, who in fact the people closest to her, it seems, have used her, have exploited the larger narrative that has, of her being, unstable, that they've exploited that in order to control her and control her wealth and control her, even her mobility. So I think that, and that is the thing, which is, I do end up, even despite my reservations, I end up feeling differently about it than I would, somebody else who, who, to my knowledge, was not under the strictures of a what sounds like a really terrible conservatorship. But I think so much of it is just, I think it just often comes down to a really erratic collective memory where we're just like, oh, okay, this person's good again, because we don't really have the energy to remember why maybe they weren't good. And sometimes that doesn't matter so much. And sometimes it's a problem because we forget things that or choose to forget things that we really shouldn't be forgetting. Like, Joe Biden, to take an issue happening right now.
Yeah, exactly. I know we're a little over our time, but I have one more question for you, if that's okay. Hopefully a quick one. But in your introduction that you just read us part of, you say the roots of rules are never so deep that they cannot be wrenched from the soil, which is such a lovely metaphor, because I love that you compared it to roots, which can be wrenched, rather than like an anchor, which we can't, lift up. It's something that's, I think, optimistic about our way forward, studying Victorian literature and its effects on us today. So I see this book as so much about our roots as contemporary women. And I'm wondering, it's very obvious, I think, what we need to leave behind in Victorian times, like what did not serve women from Victorian times. But I'm wondering what you think, what roots we should remain planted. What should we leave alone? What is actually something that we can celebrate about Victorian womanhood?
Oh God, that's such a That's such a good question. You know, I think that, you know, it's such a, I don't feel like, you know, in terms of what, you know, my position in terms of what I think is good and should be kept is, you know, it's fraught because I'm a white cisgender woman. And so I feel like really in a lot of ways I would need to defer to so many other people who do not, you know, who don't have my privileges, you know, when in terms of like, if we were to go back and look at the things that we still keep on our bookshelves and that we still teach in school. You know, I think that there is a great deal that we can hold on to as long as we historicize it correctly and contextualize it and also emphasize the extent to which it's not the only story. So, you know, a novel like Jane Eyre, sure, you know, and Cards on the Table, of course. You know, I love Jane Eyre. I love the Brontes. I love Charlotte Bronte, particularly. What I really cannot say that word today. That's and you know, and I think it's fine. You know, there's a lot. There's a lot in Jane Eyre. There's a lot of anger about limitations. The limitations placed upon women in Jane Eyre. The narrator kind of goes off here and there. The narrator is also racist and is also very kind of nationalist, or I don't know if that's, or jingoistic, you know, and so, you know, if we're going to continue to read a book in which a Creole woman is locked in an attic, a mentally ill Creole woman, then we also have to read Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, which, you know, which imagines Bertha, or rather Antoinette, the name that Rhys gives her before Rochester changes it. We have to think about what her narrative might have been, and put that uncomfortably next to this novel that we, you know, that so many of us coming of age have held on to, because, you know, there are so many of us who, you know, those of us with the privilege to see ourselves in a character like Jane. You know, she can be comforting, but she's also alienating for a lot of people. You know, we need to teach people like Mary Seacole, who is, I think she might be the only Black Victorian writer, I think, that I've ever encountered in the classroom. And, you know, and so much of that is just, you know, because stories like hers were not being published, certainly weren't being published the way that Charles Dickens's stories were being published, and with praises sung. Although Mary Seacole actually was more of a memoirist. You know, so, you know, I think that we can take it, you know, story by story, and you know, historical moment by historical moment, but, you know, in in kind of determining, or thinking about, well, what from this is still, what still seems nourishing, it has to be a really broad and probably fraught conversation. And I think it's a conversation that can only take place, or that can only happen with many other books brought into the mix, and with so many other voices, so many different voices. So I would definitely say no, absolutely, corsets banished forever. But I don't know, some of the clothes, even though they look really constraining, and I would not bring them back. I would not do that to us. Like some of the things, they're just so frilly and silly, and they look kind of great, like parasols and things.
I know, it's true. Some of them look so beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for talking with me about Too Much and about my own book. And I don't know if we're going to have Dave pop back up, but thank you so much to page 158.
Yes. Thank you, Helen, and for doing this, right before, you launched your book, and soon you're going to, I don't know if launching a child is a thing, but this
a lot of yeah, I know, it's a lot of releasing into the world right now,
which is just, you're like, it's brilliant and inspiring. So thank you, and thank you so much to Dave and page 158. This was so nice, and
it was so nice. Yeah. And I'm so glad that people are buying from their local bookstores, and keep doing that. Keep supporting the authors in the bookstores.
Yes, please.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.